A veteran, once disregarded as past his prime, carried not just the scars of battles long fought but also the burden of being overlooked. His years of service reduced to distant memories in the eyes of others. Despite the dismissal, his experiences, etched deeply in his soul, told stories of valor, sacrifice, and unyielding strength that the world had chosen to forget. The morning sun cast a soft golden hue across the fields surrounding Jack Nolan's small farm. Rows of weathered wooden fencing framed the property, their paint peeling like the calluses on Jack's hands. He leaned against the porch railing, a steaming cup of black coffee cradled in his palms. From this vantage point, the world looked peaceful, yet Jack's expression held the weight of a man who knew peace didn't come without a price. Rusty, his aging shepherd dog, padded up and rested his chin on Jack's knee. Jack smiled faintly and reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears. "Still kickin', aren't we, boy?" His voice, gruff but kind, broke the stillness of the morning. Rusty wagged his tail in agreement, his graying fur catching the sunlight. Jack's gaze drifted to the barn at the edge of the property. It leaned slightly, much like his posture these days, but it stood. He couldn't say the same for many things in his life. He glanced at the battered photograph on the small table beside him, a black and white image of 6 young men in uniform, their faces radiant with youth and hope. Jack traced a finger over the edge of the picture, his touch lingering on the man in the middle. "Another day," he muttered to himself, his voice barely above a whisper. The creak of the mailbox lid broke the morning calm. Jack straightened as a red pickup truck rattled up the dirt road, dust trailing behind it. The truck came to a stop near his front gate, and a man in a postal uniform stepped out, carrying a small package. It was Billy, the town's mailman, who always seemed to have a smile no matter the weather. "Morning, Mr. Nolan," Billy called out, his voice cheerful as he swung the gate open. Jack nodded back. "Morning, Billy." Billy handed Jack the package and hesitated, glancing toward the porch. "Got something heavy there. Need a hand with it?" Jack shook his head. "I can manage." Billy lingered for a moment, then cleared his throat. "Town's been buzzing about those boys stirring up trouble again. Logan Price and his crew. They knocked over old Mrs. Carter's fence last night, drove their bikes straight through her yard." Jack's brow furrowed, but he kept his gaze on the package. "Kids these days don't know respect." Billy nodded. "Folks are worried, Jack. I reckon they could use someone like you to, remind those boys of their manners." Jack met Billy's gaze, his expression unreadable. "Not my fight anymore." Billy hesitated, then sighed. "Well, if you change your mind, we'd all feel a lot better." With a wave, Billy climbed back into his truck and drove off, leaving Jack standing by the gate. Rusty trotted over, his ears perked as if sensing the unease in the air. Jack walked back to the porch, the package tucked under one arm. Inside, he found an old medal sent by a military buddy, a relic of a time long past. He stared at it for a moment, his jaw tightening. Later that afternoon, Jack drove his pickup into town, a once-weekly trip for supplies. The town square was bustling with activity, but the air felt heavier than usual. He parked by the hardware store and stepped out, his limp more noticeable on the uneven pavement. As he walked past the diner, a loud, jeering voice cut through the noise. "Hey, old-timer! You lose your cane?" Jack turned to see Logan Price, a cocky young man leaning against his motorcycle, his arms crossed. His friends stood nearby, laughing at the jab. Logan was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the reckless confidence of someone who'd never faced a real fight. Jack kept walking, ignoring the taunts, but Logan wasn't done. "Don't walk away, Grandpa. We're just trying to have a little fun." Jack stopped. Slowly, he turned to face Logan, his gaze steady and cold. "Fun, huh?" Logan smirked. "Yeah. The kind you used to have back in the Stone Age." Jack stared at him for a long moment, his silence unnerving Logan's crew. Then, without a word, he turned and continued into the store. Logan's grin faltered, but he quickly recovered, laughing for the benefit of his friends. "What did I tell you? Old man's got nothing left in him." Inside the hardware store, the clerk, Sarah, greeted Jack with a kind smile. "Afternoon, Mr. Nolan. How's the farm?" "Still standing," Jack replied, his tone neutral. As Sarah rang up his items, she hesitated. "You don't have to answer, but did Logan bother you just now?" Jack shook his head. "Just words. Doesn't mean anything." Sarah looked unconvinced. "Well, if it gets worse, you let someone know. Folks are worried about those boys." Jack nodded, thanked her, and left the store. Outside, Logan and his gang were gone, but their laughter still seemed to linger in the air. As Jack drove back to his farm, Rusty sitting in the passenger seat, he glanced at the medal resting on the dashboard. For the first time in years, an old feeling stirred in his chest, a mix of anger, resolve, and something deeper. "Not my fight anymore," he muttered again, but the words felt hollow. Rusty let out a soft whine, and Jack reached over to scratch his head. "Guess we'll see about that, won't we?" The sun dipped lower as Jack pulled into his driveway, casting long shadows over the fields. He sat in the truck for a moment, staring at the barn and the horizon beyond it. Something told him that the peace he'd known was about to be shattered. Jack wasn't sure if he was ready, but he knew one thing. When trouble came knocking, he wouldn't back down. Not this time. The sun climbed higher, casting the small town in bright light, but the warm glow did nothing to ease the tension settling over its residents. Jack drove his truck through the quiet streets, nodding to familiar faces, though most only offered wary glances. It had been weeks since Logan Price and his gang rolled into town, and their presence was beginning to unravel the fragile sense of peace. Outside the Harvest Diner, Jack spotted Logan's motorcycles parked in a crooked line, their chrome gleaming like the teeth of a predator. Jack pulled into a spot across the street, the old truck rattling to a stop. He wasn't there to stir trouble, just to grab lunch and check on the folks inside, but trouble had a way of finding him lately. As Jack entered the diner, a hush fell over the room. The clinking of plates and murmured conversations faded as people turned their attention to him. Behind the counter, Betty, the owner, flashed him a tight smile. "Jack," she greeted, her voice low. "Haven't seen you in a while." Jack tipped his hat. "Figured I'd stop in. Heard you've been busy." Betty's smile faltered. She glanced toward the corner booth where Logan and his crew lounged like kings, laughing loudly. One of them, a wiry man with a snake tattoo on his neck, had his boots up on the table, ignoring Betty's disapproving glare. "They've been here all morning," she muttered, her tone clipped. "Order a pot of coffee and scare off half my customers." Jack's eyes followed hers to the group. Logan was telling a story, gesturing wildly as the others howled with laughter. They hadn't noticed Jack yet, but the way they dominated the room made it clear. They didn't care who walked in. "Anything broken?" Jack asked quietly. "Not yet," Betty sighed. "But they're like a storm, Jack. You feel it coming before it hits." Jack nodded and took a seat at the counter. "Coffee," he said. "Black." Logan finally noticed Jack halfway through a boisterous retelling of his latest stunt, riding his bike through a neighbor's field. His grin widened as he leaned back in his seat, sizing up the older man. "Well, look who it is," Logan called out, loud enough for the whole diner to hear. "Old man Nolan, didn't expect to see you here." Jack ignored him, sipping his coffee. "Hey," Logan shouted, his tone sharpening. "I'm talking to you, Grandpa." The diner went silent. Betty froze mid-pour, her eyes darting between Jack and Logan. Jack set his cup down slowly, turning his head just enough to meet Logan's gaze. "I heard you the first time." Logan smirked, standing up and sauntering over to the counter. His boots echoed on the tile, and his gang followed, forming a loose circle behind him. The tension in the room thickened as Logan leaned against the counter, his face inches from Jack's. "You don't seem to like talking much, huh?" Logan taunted. "That's all right. You don't have to. Just listen." Jack's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. Logan's smirk grew. "See, we've got plans for this town," Logan continued, "and we don't need some washed-up war hero getting in the way." At the mention of Jack's service, a flicker of something crossed his face. Anger, maybe, or something deeper. But he didn't let it show. He met Logan's gaze steadily, his silence unnerving the younger man. You got nothing to say? Logan snapped, his bravado faltering. Jack finally spoke, his voice calm and measured. I got nothing to say to you. Logan's crew exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to react. Logan, however, laughed, though it was forced. Suit yourself, old man. Just remember, you stay out of our way, we stay out of yours. Deal? Jack didn't respond. He turned back to his coffee, the conversation clearly over in his mind. Logan's face darkened, but he stepped back, motioning for his gang to follow. See you around, Grandpa, Logan said, his tone dripping with mockery. As he walked out, he knocked over a chair, sending it clattering to the floor. The diner breathed again once they were gone. Betty let out a shaky sigh, her hands trembling as she wiped the counter. Thanks for not making it worse, she said softly. Jack nodded, finishing his coffee. They're not the kind to leave things alone, he muttered. This won't be the last time. Betty frowned, but she didn't argue. Be careful, Jack, she said. They've got no respect for anything or anyone. Jack tipped his hat and left, the weight of the town's fear settling heavier on his shoulders. That evening, as Jack worked on repairing the barn door, Rusty barked, his growl low and warning. Jack looked up to see headlights approaching down the dirt road. The truck came to a stop just outside the gate, and Sheriff Pete Warren stepped out, his hat in hand. Jack, Pete called out, his voice friendly but weary. Jack set down his tools and approached. Pete, what brings you out here? Pete sighed, glancing at the house as if expecting to see someone else. Wanted to talk about Logan Price and his boys. Jack crossed his arms. What about him? They've been pushing people around, same as you've seen, Pete said. But it's getting worse. Got a report this afternoon. Old man Cartwright says they were messing with his livestock. And, Pete hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. I'm stretched thin, Jack. Not enough deputies, not enough time to deal with them proper. Jack's eyes narrowed. What are you asking me, Pete? I'm asking if you'd keep an eye on things, Pete said. You've got the respect of this town. Folks trust you. Maybe you can talk some sense into them. Jack shook his head. Not my fight. Pete's shoulders sagged. Maybe not, but it's your town, same as mine. He climbed back into his truck, leaving Jack standing by the gate. The headlights faded into the night, but Pete's words lingered. Jack looked down at Rusty, who wagged his tail expectantly. Not my fight, Jack muttered again, turning back toward the barn. But, even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. The morning light brought little comfort to the townsfolk of Westbrook. Whispers of Logan Price's growing dominance filled every corner of the town, from the diner to the general store and even the church pews. Fear had seeped into daily life, a shadow following each person as they went about their routines. Jack sat on his porch, repairing a splintered handle for his hoe, his movements methodical. Rusty lay at his feet, ears twitching at the occasional bird call. Across the road, a family loaded groceries into their car, their movements rushed, their glances airy. Jack noticed how they avoided looking too long at the empty road that stretched toward the heart of town. A rumble in the distance caught Jack's attention. Moments later, Logan and his gang roared past on their motorcycles, tearing up the gravel as they sped by. The family froze, the father instinctively placing himself between the gang and his children. Logan didn't stop, but his laughter echoed as he disappeared down the road. Jack's grip tightened on the hoe handle, his knuckles whitening. Rusty growled low, his hackles raised. Easy, boy, Jack muttered, though his own anger mirrored the dog's. Later that day, Jack drove into town for feed and supplies. The general store, usually a hub of friendly conversation, was quiet. People moved quickly through the aisles, avoiding lingering too long in one spot. Jack grabbed a bag of dog food and approached the counter where Sarah, the clerk, was visibly tense. "Morning, Mr. Nolan," she said softly, her usual smile nowhere to be found. "Morning, Sarah," Jack replied. "Quiet day?" Sarah hesitated, then shook her head. "Not really. Logan and his friends were here earlier, made a mess of the front display." Jack frowned. "You call Pete?" Sarah sighed. "What's the point? Sheriff's hands are tied. Everyone knows it." She rang up Jack's items, her voice lowering. "We just hope they get bored and move on." Jack nodded, though his jaw tightened. He paid for his supplies and left without another word, but as he stepped outside, he noticed the dents in the store's front sign and the shattered remnants of a flower pot on the sidewalk. At the diner, Betty was serving lunch when the door burst open, Logan and his gang swaggering in like they owned the place. The few customers seated at the counter tensed, their forks pausing midair. Logan walked up to the counter and leaned over. "Afternoon, Betty. What's cookin'?" Betty wiped her hands on her apron, her expression neutral. "Same as always. Menu's on the board." Logan grinned. "We'll take whatever's free." His gang erupted in laughter, the sound grating against the quiet of the room. "I don't serve free meals," Betty said firmly, her voice steady despite her shaking hands. Logan leaned closer, his grin hardening into something more menacing. "Well, maybe you should start." Jack entered just as Logan reached for the napkin dispenser, knocking it onto the floor. His shadow fell across the scene, and the room went still. Logan straightened, his grin returning. "Look who it is," Logan said, spreading his arms. "Our favorite war hero." Jack ignored him and took a seat at the counter. "Coffee, Betty." Betty nodded quickly, grabbing a cup. Logan sauntered over, standing close enough for Jack to smell the leather of his jacket. "You don't scare easy, do you, old man?" Jack sipped his coffee, meeting Logan's gaze with calm eyes. "Why would I be scared of a kid who doesn't know when to sit down?" The room held its breath. Logan's grin faltered, his face flushing with anger. "You think you're funny?" Logan snapped, his voice sharp. Jack set his cup down and turned slightly, his gaze hard. "I think you've got two options. Drink your coffee and leave quietly, or keep talking and regret it." Logan stared at him, his chest heaving, but the quiet authority in Jack's voice seemed to weigh him down. He stepped back with a sneer. "Come on, boys," Logan said, turning toward the door. "Let's leave the old man to his coffee." As they left, Logan paused in the doorway, his voice low enough for only Jack to hear. "This isn't over." Jack didn't respond. That evening, Jack returned to his farm, the day's events playing over in his mind. He worked through his chores, his hands moving out of habit, but his thoughts were elsewhere. At dinner, he sat at his small kitchen table, staring at the plate of food he barely touched. Rusty sat nearby, watching him with curious eyes. Jack reached out and scratched the dog's head, his voice soft. "Used to be simple, boy. A man stood up when it was time. Now they don't even know when that is." Rusty whined, his tail thumping against the floor. Jack sighed and leaned back in his chair. The weight of the town's unspoken pleas for help pressed down on him. He had always been a man of action, a soldier who didn't wait for orders when something needed doing. But this wasn't war, and he wasn't the man he used to be. Or was he? As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the farm in shadow, Jack stood and walked to the attic. The old wooden stairs creaked under his weight as he climbed. In a corner of the attic, covered in a dusty tarp, sat a chest he hadn't opened in years. He pulled back the tarp, revealing a battered green trunk. The latches clicked open with a soft snap, and Jack stared down at its contents. His military dog tags, a faded uniform, and a stack of old letters. His hand hovered over the dog tags before he picked them up, the metal cool against his skin. Jack clenched the tags tightly, his jaw set. "Time to remind him," he muttered, his voice low. "The old man's not finished yet." Rusty barked softly from the bottom of the stairs, as if in agreement. The next morning, a light drizzle coated the town, dampening the streets but doing little to ease the tension that had taken root. Jack stood on his porch, watching the rain drip from the edges of his roof. Rusty lay by his boots, ears twitching at every sound. Jack's eyes were distant, his fingers absently tracing the cold, familiar surface of the dog tags hanging around his neck. A loud rumble broke through the soft patter of rain. Jack straightened as Logan's motorcycles came into view, their chrome reflecting the dull gray of the morning. The gang roared past his farm, dirt spraying from the road as they sped toward town. Logan was at the head of the pack, his shoulders hunched over the handlebars like a predator closing in on its prey. Rusty barked, rising to his feet. Jack sighed and grabbed his coat. "Stay here, boy," he said, patting Rusty's head before heading to his truck. In town, Logan's gang was already making their presence known. The sound of breaking glass rang out as Logan kicked over a display stand outside the general store. Sarah flinched behind the counter, her hands gripping the edge of the register. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, sweetheart," Logan drawled, leaning against the counter with a smug grin. "Just open the till, and we'll be on our way." "Please," Sarah stammered. "I don't want trouble." "Trouble?" Logan smirked, his voice mockingly sweet. "We're not trouble, Sarah. We're businessmen. And we're giving you a chance to cooperate." The door swung open, and Jack stepped inside, the bell jangling overhead. He scanned the room, taking in the overturned shelves and Logan's cocky posture. "Put it back," Jack said, his voice steady and low. Logan turned slowly, his grin widening. "Well, if it isn't Grandpa Nolan. Didn't know you were still running errands." Jack took a step closer, his boots heavy against the wooden floor. "Put it back," he repeated. Logan's gang chuckled, but the sound was uneasy. Logan tilted his head, feigning curiosity. "What if I don't? You gonna call the sheriff?" Jack's gaze didn't waver. "You don't belong here. You and your boys pack up and leave while you still can." Logan's grin vanished, replaced by a hard sneer. He pushed away from the counter, stepping into Jack's space. "You don't tell me what to do, old man. You're not in charge here anymore." Jack didn't flinch. "You're right, but someone needs to remind you what happens when a bully steps too far." The tension was thick enough to cut. Logan's jaw tightened, his fingers curling into fists. His gang exchanged uneasy glances, unsure if they should intervene. Finally, Logan chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? Some old war dog who can scare us off with a glare?" Jack's expression remained calm, but his voice dropped to a cold whisper. "I don't think. I know." Before Logan could respond, Jack moved. His hand shot out, gripping Logan's wrist and twisting it sharply. The knife Logan had been reaching for clattered to the floor. Logan yelped, stumbling back as Jack released him. The room went silent. Logan's gang stood frozen, their bravado evaporating as they saw their leader grimace in pain. "You want to finish this?" Jack asked, his tone even. "Or are you going to leave while you've still got a choice?" Logan's face darkened, his pride bruised more than his wrist. He glared at Jack, then turned to his crew. "Let's go," he snapped, pushing past them toward the door. One of the gang members hesitated, his eyes darting between Jack and Logan. "Boss." "Now," Logan barked, his voice sharp with anger. The gang filed out reluctantly, their footsteps heavy with confusion and frustration. Logan paused in the doorway, glancing back at Jack. "This isn't over," he said quietly, his tone venomous. Jack held his gaze. "It is, if you're smart." Logan scowled and slammed the door behind him, the sound echoing through the store. Sarah let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she steadied herself on the counter. "Thank you, Mr. Nolan," she said softly, her voice thick with relief. Jack nodded, his face unreadable. He turned and walked out, the bell jingling again as the door swung shut behind him. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and glistening under the overcast sky. Jack climbed into his truck, his movement slow but deliberate. Rusty barked from the passenger seat, his tail thumping against the seat. "Not yet, boy," Jack muttered, starting the engine. "We're just getting started." That night, Logan paced inside the gang's hideout, a dingy warehouse on the edge of town. His wrist throbbed, and his pride burned hotter than the cheap whiskey in his glass. "We should have finished him," one of the men muttered, earning a sharp glare from Logan. "You think I don't know that?" Logan snapped. "That old man just made himself our problem." The gang exchanged uneasy looks, but Logan's frustration was contagious. He slammed his glass down, his eyes blazing. "Tomorrow, we remind this town who's in charge," Logan growled. "And if Nolan wants to play the hero, he'll find out what it's like to be the villain's target." Outside the warehouse, the rain started again, a steady rhythm against the roof. In the distance, Jack's farm sat in darkness, the only light coming from the small lamp in his living room. Jack sat at his table, Rusty at his feet, the dog tags resting on the wood in front of him. His fingers traced the edges of the metal pinned to the tags, his thoughts drifting to battles long past. "You'll need me again, won't you?" he muttered to no one in particular. Rusty whined softly, and Jack reached down to ruffle his fur. "All right, boy," he said, his voice low but steady. "Let's see if this old dog's still got some fight left." The steady rhythm of rain on the roof lulled the town into an uneasy stillness, but Jack Nolan found no peace that night. He sat at his kitchen table, the faint light of a single lamp illuminating the room. His dog tags rested on the wood in front of him, a reminder of the man he used to be, a man who had faced fear and danger head-on, though not without scars. Rusty lay curled at Jack's feet, his ears twitching at the occasional creak of the house. Jack leaned back in his chair, staring out the window at the darkened fields beyond. Memories, sharp and unyielding, crept into his mind. The roar of gunfire echoed through the jungle, a deafening cacophony of chaos and survival. Jack, then a young and determined squad leader, barked orders over the radio, his voice steady despite the blood seeping through his uniform. His squad was pinned down, trapped by an enemy ambush that had turned their routine patrol into a nightmare. "Stay low! Move on my mark!" Jack shouted, his voice cutting through the panic. One of his men, Private Daniels, was barely 18, his face pale with fear. "We're not getting out of this, are we, Sarge?" Jack grabbed Daniels by the shoulder, forcing the young soldier to meet his eyes. "We'll get out because we don't have a choice. You hear me? Focus. Stay alive." With calculated precision, Jack led his men through the ambush, his calm under pressure saving lives that day. But not everyone made it. As they boarded the evac chopper, Jack's eyes lingered on the empty spaces where two of his men should have been. The weight of their loss never left him. Jack blinked, the jungle fading back into the quiet of his kitchen. He rubbed his temple, the ache in his chest a familiar companion. Rusty lifted his head, sensing his master's unease. Jack reached down and patted the dog's head. "Some nights, it just doesn't let go. Does it, boy?" Rusty wagged his tail softly, offering silent comfort. The next day dawned gray and heavy, the rain lingering in the air. Jack rose early, his body moving out of habit rather than energy. He fed the chickens, repaired a section of the fence, and checked the locks on the barn. Each task was methodical, a way to keep his hands busy while his mind raced. By mid-morning, a knock at the door startled him. Rusty barked, his ears perking up as Jack opened the door to find Sheriff Pete Warren. "Pete?" Jack said, nodding in greeting. "Jack," Pete replied, his face grim. "Got a feeling you know why I'm here." Jack stepped aside, letting the sheriff in. Pete removed his hat, fidgeting with it as he stood in the middle of the room. "Logan's making noise again," Pete said. "Threatened Sarah after you left the store yesterday. Said anyone who crosses him won't get a second chance." Jack leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "And what's your plan?" Pete sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Plan? Hell, Jack, I've got a deputy and a prayer. These boys aren't scared of the law, and I don't have the manpower to make them." Jack studied the sheriff for a moment, his expression unreadable. "So, you're here to tell me to back off?" "Not exactly," Pete admitted. "I'm here to ask if there's anything you can do. People listen to you, Jack. They see you as someone who can handle things." Jack's eyes narrowed. "I told you before, this isn't my fight." Pete's shoulders slumped. "Maybe it's not, but it's ours, and we're losing it. You know what happens if we don't stand up to Logan? He'll bleed this town dry, just like the last place he ran through." Jack didn't respond immediately. He looked out the window at the fields, his thoughts heavy. "Just think about it," Pete said quietly, "before it's too late." The sheriff left, his footsteps heavy on the porch. Rusty watched him go, then turned to Jack, wagging his tail as if waiting for a decision. That evening, Jack returned to the attic. The trunk sat where he'd left it, its contents as heavy as the memories they carried. He opened it again, this time pulling out more than the dog tags. An old field map, its edges frayed, lay folded at the bottom. Next to it was a combat knife, its handle worn but sturdy. Jack held it in his hands, testing its weight. Rusty barked softly from the doorway, his tail thumping against the frame. "You think I'm crazy, don't you?" Jack asked, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Rusty wagged his tail harder. Jack placed the knife back in the trunk and closed it. "Maybe I am," he muttered, "but sometimes crazy's what gets the job done." As the sun set, Jack stood on his porch, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The distant hum of motorcycles reached his ears, growing louder by the minute. Logan's gang was on the move again, their path heading toward the edge of town. Jack clenched his fists, the dog tags cool against his chest. The image of Logan's sneer and the fear in Sarah's eyes flashed through his mind. He turned and walked into the house, grabbing his coat. Rusty barked, running to his side as Jack headed toward the truck. "It's time, boy," Jack said, his voice low. "Let's remind him what happens when you push too far." Rusty jumped into the passenger seat, his tail wagging furiously. As Jack started the engine, the headlights cut through the growing darkness. This time, he wasn't heading to town to watch. He was heading to make sure they knew what kind of man they were dealing with. For the first time in years, Jack felt the fire of purpose reignite in his chest. It wasn't about the past anymore. It was about protecting what was left. The town square was unusually quiet, the air heavy with unease. The few shops that remained open did so with their blinds half drawn, and conversations were hushed. Logan Price and his gang were out in full force, their laughter and crude taunts echoing through the streets as they prowled on their motorcycles. Inside Sarah's general store, Jack stood at the counter, paying for a bag of feed. He noticed her hands trembling as she handed him his change. Her face was pale, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced with a look of exhaustion and dread. "They were here again this morning," Sarah said softly, not meeting his eyes. Jack glanced over his shoulder at the door, then back at her. "What happened?" "Logan came in with his boys," she whispered. "They knocked over shelves, broke a few jars, said it was a warning." Jack's jaw tightened. "You call Pete?" Sarah shook her head. "What's the point? They don't care about the law, and Pete can't stop them. They said they'll be back for more. I don't know how much longer I can keep this place open." Jack nodded, his expression grim. "I'll see what I can do." As he turned to leave, Sarah grabbed his arm. "Jack, please, be careful." By late afternoon, Logan's gang made their presence known again, this time targeting the Harbor Cafe. Jack was across the street at the hardware store when he heard the commotion. "Hey!" Logan's voice boomed as he shoved an outdoor table, sending it crashing to the ground. The cafe owner, Martin, stepped out, his face pale but determined. "Enough, Logan," Martin shouted, his voice shaking. "This is my business, and I won't let you destroy it." Logan grinned, sauntering closer. "Your business, huh? Well, I don't see your name on it." Before Martin could respond, one of Logan's men grabbed him by the collar and shoved him against the wall. The cafe's patrons scattered, watching helplessly from a distance. Jack stepped out of the hardware store, his gaze locking onto the scene. Without hesitation, he crossed the street, his boots heavy on the pavement. "Let him go," Jack said, his voice calm but firm. Logan turned, his grin widening. "Well, well, if it isn't our favorite war hero. Come to save the day, old man?" Jack stopped a few feet away, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. "I said, let him go." The gang laughed, but there was an edge of nervousness to it. Logan's man hesitated, glancing at his leader for direction. "Do it," Logan ordered, his tone mocking. "Let him go. Let's see what Grandpa here wants to do about it." The gang released Martin, who stumbled back, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Jack stepped forward, placing himself between the gang and Martin. "You've had your fun," Jack said evenly. "Now leave." Logan's grin faltered, his bravado cracking under Jack's unyielding gaze. "Or what?" Logan sneered, though his voice wavered. Jack took another step closer, his voice lowering to a cold, dangerous tone. "Or you'll find out why they call me Colonel." The tension snapped taut. For a moment it seemed like Logan might back down, but his pride wouldn't let him. "Get him!" Logan barked. Two of his men lunged at Jack. With startling speed, Jack sidestepped the first attacker, grabbing his arm and twisting it behind his back. The man cried out in pain before Jack shoved him aside, sending him sprawling. The second man swung a fist, but Jack blocked it with precision, landing a swift elbow to the ribs that left the man gasping for air. Logan froze, his gang hesitating as they watched their leader for guidance. Jack straightened, his eyes locked on Logan. "Last warning," he said. "Walk away." Logan's fists clenched, but he held back, his confidence shaken. Finally, he motioned for his men to retreat. "This isn't over, old man," Logan hissed. Jack watched them go, his stance unwavering until the sound of their motorcycles faded into the distance. Word of the confrontation spread quickly, and by evening, Jack found himself surrounded by neighbors at his farm. "Thank you, Jack," Martin said, his voice thick with gratitude. "If you hadn't stepped in—" "You're a hero," Sarah added, her eyes shining with emotion. Jack raised a hand, quieting the crowd. "I'm no hero," he said firmly. "I'm just a man doing what's right. But this won't end here. Logan and his crew aren't going to stop unless we make them." The group exchanged uncertain glances. "What do we do, Jack?" someone asked. Jack's gaze swept over them, his expression resolute. "We stand together. We defend what's ours. They rely on fear, but if we show them we won't be pushed around, they'll break." "But how?" Sarah asked. "We're not fighters like you." "You don't have to be," Jack replied, "but you do have to be smart and prepared." That night, Jack began working with the townsfolk, teaching them basic defense tactics and strategies. He mapped out the town, identifying key points to protect and areas to watch. "We don't need to fight them head-on," Jack explained. "We just need to make it clear they're not welcome here." As the town rallied behind Jack, a sense of hope began to replace the fear. Families repaired fences, businesses fortified their windows, and people walked the streets with their heads held a little higher. But Jack knew the real test was yet to come. Logan wasn't the kind of man to back down easily. In the early hours of the morning, Jack stood on his porch watching the horizon. Rusty lay by his feet, his ears perked as if sensing the coming storm. The faint hum of motorcycles reached Jack's ears, growing louder with each passing second. He clenched his fists, the weight of the dog tags around his neck grounding him. "They're coming, boy," Jack said, his voice low but steady. "And they're going to learn the hard way." Rusty barked once, his tail wagging. Jack turned and walked inside, grabbing the combat knife from the trunk. This time he wouldn't just stand his ground. This time he'd finish it. The pre-dawn air was heavy with tension, the faint hum of motorcycles growing louder as Logan Price's gang approached. Jack stood at the edge of his property, his weathered hands resting on the gate. Rusty barked softly beside him, his tail stiff and ears alert. Jack had spent the night preparing. Makeshift barricades lined the entrance to his driveway, and the fields were dotted with carefully hidden traps. Simple, effective deterrents born of a soldier's ingenuity. The townsfolk had done their part, reinforcing their homes and shops, but Jack knew this was his fight to lead. As the motorcycles roared into view, a cloud of dust rising behind them, Jack's jaw tightened. Logan was at the head of the pack, his eyes gleaming with a mix of rage and arrogance. The gang pulled to a stop just outside the gate, their engines idling like growling beasts. "Well, look who's ready for a standoff," Logan called, his voice mocking. "Didn't know you were throwing a party, Grandpa." Jack didn't flinch. "You've crossed the line, Logan. You don't belong here." Logan grinned, swinging a leg over his bike as he dismounted. "That's so? Funny, I don't remember asking for your permission." The gang laughed, but their confidence wavered as Jack stepped forward, his presence steady and commanding. "You've got two choices," Jack said, his voice calm but laced with steel. "Turn around and leave for good, or I'll make sure you regret staying." Logan's grin twisted into a sneer. "You think you scare me, old man? This is my town now, and I don't take orders from has-beens." Logan motioned to one of his men, a wiry biker with a crowbar in hand. The man stepped forward, smirking as he approached the gate. "You really think this old fence is going to stop us?" he taunted, raising the crowbar. The moment he struck, a loud snap rang out as a concealed tripwire released. A heavy plank swung down from the gate post, striking the biker square in the chest. He flew backward, landing with a groan as the gang erupted in startled curses. Logan's eyes narrowed. "Clever, but you're only delaying the inevitable." Jack remained still, his eyes locked on Logan. "Next one won't be so polite." The gang hesitated, shifting uneasily as they scanned the property. Jack's traps were simple but effective, and the unknown was enough to give even the boldest among them pause. Logan growled in frustration. "Get him!" Two more bikers charged, one armed with a chain and the other with a baseball bat. Jack moved with practiced precision, sidestepping the first attacker and using the man's momentum to send him tumbling into a ditch. The second swung wildly, but Jack ducked and landed a solid punch to his ribs, knocking the wind out of him. Rusty barked and growled, circling to keep the others at bay. Logan stepped forward, fury written across his face. "Enough playing around. I'm going to end this myself." Jack stood his ground, his combat knife gleaming in the early morning light. "You're welcome to try." Logan lunged, swinging a heavy wrench. Jack blocked the attack with his forearm, the impact sending a sharp jolt up his arm. He countered with a swift kick to Logan's knee, forcing him to stagger back. The two circled each other, the gang watching in tense silence. Logan swung again, but Jack ducked and grabbed his wrist, twisting it until the wrench clattered to the ground. With a firm shove, Jack sent Logan sprawling. "This is your last chance," Jack said, his voice low and deadly. "Leave." Logan scrambled to his feet, his bravado replaced with a flicker of fear, but he wasn't ready to admit defeat. "Guys, get him!" Logan shouted. Before the gang could advance, the wail of sirens filled the air. Sheriff Pete Warren's patrol car skidded to a stop nearby, and several townsfolk emerged from the shadows, armed with makeshift weapons. "You're outnumbered, Logan," Pete called, stepping out of the car. His shotgun rested in his hands, though he kept the barrel pointed toward the ground. "This ends here." The gang exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence crumbling as they realized the tide had turned. Logan snarled, his fists clenched. "You think this is over? You think you've won?" Jack stepped closer, his gaze hard. "It's over when you leave. And if I ever see you or your crew in this town again, you won't get another warning." Logan hesitated, his eyes darting between Jack, the sheriff, and the gathered townsfolk. Finally, he spat on the ground and motioned to his gang. "Let's go," he growled, his voice dripping with bitterness. One by one, the bikers mounted their motorcycles and rode off, their engines fading into the distance. Logan was the last to leave, his glare burning into Jack as he revved his engine and sped away. As the dust settled, the townsfolk approached Jack, their expressions a mix of relief and gratitude. "You saved us," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Thank you, Jack." Jack shook his head. "I didn't do this alone. You all stood up for what's right. That's what matters." Pete stepped forward, clapping a hand on Jack's shoulder. "You did good, Jack. Real good." Jack nodded, his eyes scanning the faces around him. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of belonging, a reminder that even in the quietest moments, there was a place for men like him. Back at the farm, Jack sat on his porch, Rusty lying contentedly at his feet. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the fields in shades of gold and orange. Jack held his dog tags in his hand, the metal warm from the day's heat. He thought of the men he'd lost, the battles he'd fought, and the small victory they'd earned today. "You'd have been proud," he murmured, his voice soft but resolute. Rusty wagged his tail, his head resting on Jack's boot. As the stars began to appear, Jack leaned back in his chair, a faint smile on his lips. The fight was over, but the lessons of the day lingered. Strength wasn't just in the body. It was in the heart, in the willingness to stand up when it mattered most. And Jack Nolan still had plenty of fight left in him. As the stars lit up the night sky, Jack Nolan sat quietly on his porch, the echo of a hard-fought victory settling into the stillness. He wasn't a hero for medals or recognition. He was a hero because he stood up when others couldn't. Jack showed us that courage isn't about being the strongest. It's about being willing to fight for what's right, no matter the odds. In the end, the man dismissed as past his glory proved that experience, heart, and resolve could outmatch even the loudest threats. Jack's story isn't just about a town saved from a gang. It's a reminder that one person's determination can inspire an entire community to rise. If this story moved you as much as it moved us, don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who could use a little inspiration today. What did you think of Jack's unwavering spirit? Would you stand up the way he did? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoy stories about resilience, courage, and redemption, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss another tale of everyday heroes making a difference. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.